Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Atomic Podcast. I'm extremely excited to be here with Anya Foxen, and she's a writer and a scholar that really looks at different levels of experience, both experience as we can call really that sort of touches on the scientific, on the material, and on the spiritual and immaterial. And what I love about Anya's work is that her work kind of looks across these different touch points to have a much more comprehensive view, one of who we are as human beings, but also how knowledge is put together. You know, how we experience knowledge and sort of regard and sometimes disregard exceptional experience. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Anna. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Rodney. I love that. It makes what I do sound so much more grand than I could ever express it to be. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess kind of on that note that you mentioned about, yeah, just sort of like life and experience and science and all these things. Let me maybe start by saying that my first like scholarly love was really literature. Um, and so as much as I have this sort of ongoing flirtation, right, with like the sciences, I think I really think about myself as being like firmly situated in the humanities, which has been an interesting, sort of maybe boundary to navigate. Um, yeah, and then I guess my formal academic career has mostly actually been as a historian of yoga, which is a odd little niche field. Um, but for me, that really sort of started, right? It was launched because I was a practitioner. I started practicing yoga when I was, God, 18, something like that, right? So clearly a very formative experience. And so I think a lot of my, from the books that I've published to just even, what I went to grad school to study was really kind of focused on, I mean, sure, the culture, right? And these questions of what is culture and how does cultural transmission works and work in the history of all the stuff in the philosophy. But fundamentally, it was sort of about me trying to understand that experience. Right? What is it that I'm doing when I go into this like weird, hot, sweaty, loud room? Um, and so I think now that I've sort of reached maybe, like almost mid-career, I'm really coming back to those questions. And I have found myself thinking about, all these things that you mentioned, kind of how does it all tie together? What is experience, right? That kind of stuff.
But also, what is practice, right?
Uh-huh.
It's like an embodied practice, and how does embodied practice have a huge impact, and I should say relationship, not an impact, but relationship to mind, right? And to consciousness. And
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure that's kind of where you find yourself situated. And then one more, just like a question is that when you say humanities and you have the smile, um, so, it's almost like you're almost apologizing for occupying a place that has been near and dear, for hundreds of years, but now is somehow in question.
Hmm. Well, yeah. And I mean, I think a lot of us in the humanities like to sort of apologize for our existence, right? Or feel that we need to, simply because I think that the humanities aren't taken as seriously, right? Whether that's in academia or certainly in industry. Um, but at the same time, I mean, yes, right? Like you're absolutely correct. It has been sort of like the bedrock of human knowledge from time immemorial. And in my mind, actually, these things are not so separate, right? I mean, disciplines are sort of weird and fuzzy anyway. But even these distinctions between ultimately, I think the sciences and the humanities, I mean, yes, they're there and they're important. The methodologies certainly are and should be different on some level. But also like we are sort of trying to answer the same questions ultimately, right? Like what is this? Even though we don't maybe always do it in the same way.
Well, give me an example of this, this,
Mm.
um, maybe a certain kind of experience that might be more scientifically nuanced versus much more either poetic or spiritually nuanced, and how
Mm.
that particular sort of object of knowledge gets seen differently.
Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted to sort of jump straight to like consciousness or something, but maybe let's not do that because it's impossible to define. But let's maybe talk about movement, right? Just
Movement,
because I
yes.
think it's a very tangible practice that people can sort of wrap their heads around. So obviously there are all sorts of empirical scientific ways to talk about movement, right? And what movement does to the human body, maybe even to the human mind, right? I mean, like when we're engaging in proprioceptive movement, for instance, like, I mean, this is outside my area of expertise, but I imagine there are certain centers in the brain that light up, for instance, right? And we can sort of use that to explain, okay, so what is this experience, right, of doing this thing with our bodies? But then on the other hand, like that doesn't really capture the entirety of either the process, right, the mechanical process itself, or certainly the first person subjective experience that all of us have when we move, especially when we move intentionally and we move in specific ways, right? Whether that's running or dancing or whatever, right? Anything. And so that's where I think you do cross that line into a kind of description where maybe the methods of the humanities become more important, right? When we talk about sort of like the qualitative nature of this and what is it like, and not even necessarily what does it mean, but sort of like what is it in this way that is sort of tangible. It has to be because it literally just structures our entire experience of the world, right? I mean, like on some level, we all have a much more, I think, concrete understanding of what it is to move, from that sort of, again, first person humanistic subjective lens than we understand that scientifically, unless you're literally sort of like I don't know, a physiologist or something, right? Like you probably would be hard pressed to describe the physiological or the cognitive mechanics of movement.
Well, let's try. Um, so when we're thinking about yoga and asanas, asanas have a particular one salience to experience,
Mhm.
but they also have a certain kind of purpose, right? Um,
Mm,
and the idea of seeing an asana from and a provocative question from more of a materialist standpoint versus an
mhm,
more immaterial, how do you see that those different journeys? Um, so I come in and I'm in a yoga class and I have my notepad or my iPhone and I'm, my eye tracking or several
mhm,
things as a scientist that I might, because I want to capture movement, right?
mhm,
Capturing behavior, perhaps. Um, or I could be capturing EEG. I could be doing
uh-huh,
other things, right? But then I'm a yoga instructor and I'm a historian of yoga. And maybe I have a higher position,
mhm,
astral position, we'll say. That being said, I'm looking for something very different in that asana.
mhm.
But am I looking for all those things or something just completely different?
Well, let me ask you a question to your
Yeah,
question.
question to question.
So,
Yeah,
so when you say that the movement or the asana has a purpose, like what do you mean by that?
I know it was
You
provocative,
have
right?
something specific in mind? What is the purpose?
Well, I think, look, when we enter into a practice such as yoga, um,
Mhm,
we can bring all kinds of assumptions to it, right? Um,
mhm,
the, that might sort of, uh, I'll say, predate or be well before a purpose we might feel, but we are there for a reason,
mhm.
okay? And so asanas may have different benefits, what not just to certain parts of the body,
Sure.
but also certain states of consciousness. So there is purpose, especially
Mhm,
as you become more
mhm.
involved and or more expert at what you do, to the kinds of practices that you engage with, or so that's what I say.
Mhm.
It's not like a purpose like an engineering, objective function,
Right.
this is what we're doing and this is how it gets done.
Mhm, mhm.
It's more of a purpose that I may feel and I'm engaged with to create, let's say, a state of mind or a state of peace, right?
Yeah.
You know, um, and I think that's what I mean by that.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's really useful. Thanks for clarifying that. And I think that's also sort of where like it gets both really tricky and really interesting, right? And I mean, again, to some extent, this is sort of maybe the disciplinary distinction is that like once you're in the realm of the subjective and the human, like things are not clear cut because they are subjective. Right? Your purpose is going to be on some level your purpose. And I can't, I think, just like, sort of from a purely like epistemological standpoint, ever really know what that is, right? Because I'm not you. Um, but even I think maybe more objectively, right, more broadly than that, this is where like context and culture and all this kind of stuff becomes really important. Um, I mean, I think like maybe now I'm getting more into these questions of, yeah, like what is this stuff doing, right, on all these multiple levels? What is the meaning? What is the purpose? And I'm still really trying to figure out how to ask that question in a way that doesn't just sort of collapse back into, well, like where is it culturally sitting? But up until now, the where is it culturally sitting question, I think, has been really central to a lot of my scholarship, and I think that's always going to be there. The thing with something like yoga, which is a practice that, I mean, I think even to say that it's been transmitted cross-culturally is sort of erasing a lot of the complexity. It's really a hybrid practice. It's something that's sort of blended both throughout its history in South Asia, right? I mean, there was never sort of one quintessential yoga that you can sort of point to and be like, oh, like that's it, right? That's the practice. That's what it looks like. That's what it's supposed to do, right? That's the purpose. There's wherever you look in history, there's always like sort of different goals that people have, right? How is it that they sort of imagine, like, where is this going to take me ultimately? Am I becoming one with the universe? Is the universe even one thing? Or am I actually maybe sort of separating, right? Like my consciousness from this sort of like more, like this inferior material embodied experience. Am I a dualist or am I a non-dualist, right? I mean, these would be sort of salient questions to ask, even in that kind of pre-modern context, if we're talking about yoga. And then once you bring kind of the global context in, right, then it gets like real wild and messy. I don't think that modern Western practitioners, for instance, have the same goals and assign the same purpose to their practice as, an Indian practitioner in like the year 300 BCE would have. That doesn't mean that there is no goal and there is no purpose to their practice. But so much of that is already sort of determined, right, by like the tools that we have. And I mean, yeah, that's sort of for us, right? That sort of sciencey way of parsing reality and parsing our bodies. I think you can't really sort of divorce what we understand to be materially happening to our bodies from whatever, like however we imagine that goal to be. That kind of makes sense.
It does, it does. And I think something that's really interesting is the way you're talking about history of yoga and culture as something that is always a translation each and every moment. You're not taking some sort of pure practice and bringing it along, through the
Mhm.
ages. It changes as cultures change, and I think that's super important because I not only that, it's also quite intimate on an individual level. And I think even though people will do it, and I've done it, you've done a lot more than I have, you're in a room often.
Mhm.
It's remarkable how intimate it is, and and that has a huge value. I mean, I think a huge value, kind of in a group, but intimate, uh,
Mhm.
in a world of kind of social division and AI and some other aspects of our life. But I wanted to ask you this question. How do you see that cultural sort of melding happening today with yoga? Like where have
Mhm.
we landed, and maybe some wonderful cultural moments where yoga did make a change or did make or figures that pushed yoga in different directions
Mhm.
from
Mhm.
your scholarship?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on how broadly you understand our present cultural moment. And I think right
Just
now we
open the lens for me.
are. Well, we are in the middle, I think, of another sort of reconfiguration, right? And I teach college students, so I see this stuff sort of shifting with them, over the years and just even really over the past decade. There's been some remarkable stuff that's happened with like how they're talking about these things like cultural appropriation, for instance, right? Because with yoga, that's always sort of like the buzzword. Um, and it is an important issue, right? Like, and it's good that now there's sort of this higher level of attention and sensitivity to this stuff. I think sometimes it does become a little bit self-defeating, right? Because we're just sort of like, we throw up our hands, we're like, okay, well, like, I don't want to be appropriating this, right? So let me just like not even engage with it. And that's maybe not the most useful thing. But I think that there has been this sort of reconfiguration, this like sort of greater like level of complexity with how we're talking about culture and how we're understanding the way that cultures interact. Um, but to some extent, I mean, and there's this, sort of rabbit hole that one could go down if one really wanted to talk about like yoga studies. Um, I think the current state of the field is very much that what we talk about as modern yoga, the yoga that you and I, are probably familiar with, when we go into the gym or when we go into a local studio or something like that. Um, the way that practice looks, this focus on like physical postures or asanas, for instance, right? The way that it is physical in a very specific way kind of goes back to maybe the mid 19th century at the earliest. I mean, it's obviously, it's not as though there's some kind of break point, right? Where like before that it's completely different. Um, but like most things in modernity, like modernity sort of starts in earnest, right? In the 19th century. If you rewind that far back, you can at least sort of recognize still some of the same cultural trends and ways of looking at the world that, we're still sort of sitting in today. And so because that's also the moment at which yoga becomes globalized, in a much more meaningful way, where there is this sort of I mean, to oversimplify it, like East-West interaction that takes place. There are all these yoga teachers that go west, both across Europe, but especially to North America and to the United States. There's this sort of like almost like a critical mass of change that I think really shifts the way that the practice itself operates. And people begin kind of translating this language that maybe earlier would have been a little bit more philosophical, metaphysical, right? All this sort of talk of the subtle body, for instance, into terms that are much more kind of empirical and scientific. They are talking about what this is doing to the physical body now, right? I mean, they're using terminology that's medical, that's physical, that we would sort of be, more familiar with. And I think that changes the way that that the practice is able to travel to some extent. Because once we start talking about like just the physical mechanics of the body, it at least seems as though there's some sort of like universality to that. Right. I mean, like we all breathe, right? We all have a pulse. Right. We like these things happen to our bodies. And so we can talk about sort of objectively, seemingly, how it is that the practice is able to sort of influence and produce that. Whereas if we're talking about different cultural models, right, and like chakras and things like that, that gets a little bit more, sort of like specific, right? So I think that where we are now is trying to sort of figure out like how do we talk about this practice in both ways, both as something that is objective on some level, right? Like you do physical things and physical things happen to your body, to your mind, to your whole organism. But also it's cultural, right? And that's where that meaning component comes in. So like, why are you doing this thing with your body? Right? What do you think is happening? What are you trying to achieve? Right? What's the purpose? What's the meaning? What's the goal of this practice? And I think like again, like I said, we're sort of in this moment of trying to figure out how that fits together, right? How it can be both and it's both objective and it's subjective on some level.
Yeah, and when we think of culture, of course, it's huge. You're talking to someone that just so you know if you know this that has I would say deep anthropological experience. Um, so um, so culture is not a bumper sticker. It's a lot of
Mhm.
nuance. But also it's been misused and in so many ways as a term, as a concept. But let's put all those apologies aside.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm super fascinated with the fact that science really has started to be much more rigorous in capturing different states of mind.
Mhm.
And then trying to find models of consciousness that actually can operate across different forms of experience. Of course, psychedelics play into this somewhat in terms, and I think it's more of a fashion, but it is a route uh,
Mhm.
for higher levels of or self-transcendence that I think are important. But the point is that in medicine, or more clinically, we often think of the mind over matter as a placebo effect,
Mm.
and then on this other side, we actually is not, like you say, a dualism. Mind and body are really very fused in the way in which we expect and inhabit ourselves, in our experience, say yoga being an experience. And so I go back to this idea of like what Madame Blavatsky, what, theosophy stuff, um, and that was a big attempt. As crazy as it was, as wild as it was, and in fact, the crazier it is, the more I like it. Is is that it was an attempt between astral and physical and
Mhm.
physics and so many things, and so I think that attempt now is alive and well, across the sciences. We just don't. We always are talking past each other, um,
Mhm.
and I find that very unfortunate, because I think we have a lot to share across these different disciplines, and then we're very apologetic that we're appropriating. I'm not saying you are, or I'm not saying that I'm not, but the idea is like, how could we ever live without appropriating? Um, we're creative beings, right?
Of
And
course.
I'm not
Yeah.
giving like wholesale license to all kinds of stuff, but I'm just saying. And I think in this particular area you're touching on in yoga, there's a lot of borrowing, there's a lot of melding. And so I'm interested in like what got you there to do
Mm.
more of a deeper dive and historical look at yoga. Like, why would you go down that route and just stay on the mat, man?
Well, and I think a lot of it actually are these issues that you just sort of brought up, right? Like the way that when we're talking about consciousness, when we're talking about the mind, when we're talking about how that sort of lives in the body in practice, like we're often talking past each other, and that's really frustrating. Um, and I think, for me, like it's really only been within the last, gosh, I don't know, maybe 5 years or so, maybe even less, that I've begun taking my own practice seriously. And I'll sort of explain what I mean by that, right? Because it's like for me, it's a big deal personally. Um, because I think we do have this kind of like way of separating, the mental and the physical, and consciousness, and sort of like empirical bodily, like what's going on physiologically sort of stuff. Um, and then there's all the baggage that, sort of just yoga has as yoga, including all this anxiety about appropriation and authenticity and stuff like that. And then of course the fact that in the US, it's mostly practiced by, like skinny middle class white women. And I mean, okay, right? Like, hi, here I am. I fit the demographic, but there is this sort of maybe like a lack of seriousness that comes along with that, right? Like this is somehow like it's consumeristic, right? And it's superficial, and like certainly it can't be an actual like legit philosophical spiritual practice, right? Because of all this kind of cultural baggage. And even though I've spent now, I mean, I think legitimately the last 15, 20 years kind of on paper, as a historian, as a scholar of religion, pushing back against that, like I almost kind of just like didn't believe myself, right? Um, because I would still go into that yoga studio and be like, okay, like this makes me feel good. And like, all right, great. Like I'm exercising, and like, yes, it has this deep history. But like, what is it doing really? Right. Um, and so certainly, right, like all of those questions have been percolating for me, in the back of my mind for as long as I've been studying this stuff, which is coming up on about 20 years now. And so in a weird way, I think I've sort of, with this new direction that my scholarship is taking, I've come back around to the initial thing that sort of like sparked my interest as a historian to begin with, um, which is like, what is happening when I go into this room, and when I get on the mat, when I start actually doing this stuff with my body? Um, because I've kept doing it for a very simple reason. It does something to me, right? Like it is this sort of like symbiotic thing. Um, And there is an experience there. And it's also taken me a while to sort of accept the fact that, I mean, sure, I'm like not floating off the ground. Maybe like the medieval texts say that I should. And I'm not, having these sort of like cosmic psychedelic trips. Um, but also like it's kind of not ordinary experience, right? It's not just that like I feel good and like I'm exercising. It genuinely has reframed my way of understanding the world and understanding my body and understanding what mind and consciousness are. Um, and so I think that like there's something there, right, in that embodied experience that I think has helped me think about, I mean, everything, history, philosophy, right, science, in a more productive way. And I think that when we chop these things up into different disciplines, right, and especially when we sort of dismiss with what's going on, with bodies in particular, but with like kind of matter more generally, we're really sort of shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to actually maybe understanding reality in a more holistic way.
You said something to me along this line when we talked before, and I know you talk fairly frequently with Jeff Kripal, where I think folks in and around um, some of the impossible experiences, I'll say,
Mm,
the work he's done. But more generally, do think that there is not only epiphanies, but very exceptional experiences that are marginalized in society, which I believe is true. But you said something that I think is really to the point you were just saying, which is there's also really exceptional experiences in the ordinary. Uh,
mm,
and that either we forget to be either attentive enough to capture them and see them and feel them, or they get commoditized, or we just don't pay attention. Um, so I think that's a really powerful thing to think about. And I just wanted to ask, you're saying the same similar thing here. It's like
mm,
not just asking what's going on, but you're kind of describing what's going on. And that it's pretty ordinary and you're sweaty and you do the things in kind of ordinary ways, but it's kind of awesome. And it's like, you look around and you look around in the studio and you're like, do people see how incredible this is? you know? And I find that in life in general, but I just wanted to say that idea of exceptional experience in the ordinary, how does that get framed in the way you think about this, getting at that thing you're talking about? Is that
yeah.
kind of a way of being, a way of thinking, a practice? How do we stay awake? Come on, Anya.
Mm. Well, and yeah, I mean, I think my way of sort of thinking through this, right? Like, even though like it is where my scholarship is going, right? And like as a good scholar, I'm trying to figure out like, okay, like how do I lay this out systematically, right? And how do I be objective and what is it? But to some extent, I think like because you are getting into like some pretty deep ontological stuff, um, my way of looking at it and explaining it is going to be influenced by like my ontology to some extent, right? Like insofar as I'm anything, I'm probably a non-dualist ultimately, right? So like I'm very drawn to this idea that like, okay, like if weird stuff truly happens, and I believe that it does, right? And I think that stuff is important to talk about. So I'm really, really grateful for the work of people like Jeff. But like actually, if we're gonna take that stuff seriously, right, and sort of integrate it into how it is that we understand and how we look at the world, like that stuff has to be part and parcel of also then like all the regular stuff, right? Like it's got to then all be coming out of one reality. So on some level, that has to mean that like ordinary reality is also really just weird, right, like it's all one thing. um and so I think that what I'm really interested in is kind of like that other, what I consider to be the other side of the coin, right, or the other sort of end of the puzzle. um and like I mean I've said this to Jeff before, like why is it always about aliens, right? And like why do we need to like always just talk about the weird stuff? And I love the weird stuff, right? Don't get me wrong. Like I would love to sit down and talk about aliens for hours and hours and hours. But like, okay, sure, right? But then what about over here? Right? What about these absolutely sort of ordinary experiences that we're sort of, I mean, what, then just like sort of shuffling to the side? Because that's the majority of our waking consciousness, right? I think for most of us. And some of this is personal, right? I'm not an experiencer in that way. I don't talk to, angels or mermaids or like see UFOs. Like it's not my experience. Um, I believe that people do. I'm just not one of those people. Um, and so I think for a long time I felt this sort of weird imposter syndrome almost, right? Like I don't have anything to say about this kind of stuff because I don't have some kind of, firsthand handle on what it is. Until eventually I realized like no, actually like the way that I understand reality is different from, all my friends that work in like the sciences, for instance, right? And just sort of like spend their days like duct taping stuff together. Um, and there's probably something to that. Um, and so I think that if we actually, again, if we want to sort of figure out what's going on in some kind of, big picture way, we have to look at the whole picture. And so what we consider to be the ordinary sort of needs to be a part of it. Also, like, I think just the world is a lot less boring that way, you know?
Yeah, the idea of this how can I say the disregarding the ordinary as being boring. The ordinary is extraordinary, as if is what you're saying. This other side of the coin. Uh, if you're attentive enough, or you have
Mm,
perhaps some help with practices and approaches, and also a community uh,
mhm,
that really allows you to stay in that frame of reference and frame of mind. And I think one thing I wanted to ask you in your work in yoga and also the scholarship of yoga, how does context and community, I also say community,
mm,
come into play, you know, in
yeah,
terms of giving rise to certain forms of experience?
mhm. Well, I mean, I think a lot of that, it depends, right? I mean, obviously, again, like culture, meaning, all that stuff. But I think maybe even the more interesting, at least again, sort of where I'm at these days, and sort of, I think what I hear you pointing at element of it is, yeah, what physically happens when people do this stuff together, right? I mean, there's sort of, nerdy sociological terms for this, right? Like we could call it collective effervescence. Um, but the fact of the matter is, I mean, again, it's about embodied experience. And as embodied beings, I mean, we just like we aren't ever really separate from one another. Right? The way that we sort of come to understand our bodies, how we learn to use and move our bodies, all of that is already so social. Um, and so I think that, yeah, there's something about, even if you're not necessarily, because there's very little, I think, like dogma in modern yoga studios. In fact, I think most studio owners like very sort of consciously avoid that, because it gets you into all that kind of very sticky territory. Um, and so I think it's more about this sort of practice on that level, right? And so it is immediate, it is in that room. Um, but being in that room, being in that community, right, like moving your body in that space with all these other people, like again, that just sort of objectively does something. um right, and there's any number of ways that you could talk about it. I mean, you could talk about brain waves synchronizing, right, or you could talk whatever. um right, and I think there are all those layers to it. But yeah, like the I think the kind of the socialness, the community, is very closely tied to just like the humanness of that experience.
Yeah, I think what I'm pointing to, definitely what you're describing, I'm pointing to, but something else that where the social gets between you and what you consider to be an experience.
Mm,
So we forget, and one of the things I've learned over the last, 20, 30 years in some of the early theoretical feminist writings, um, is that happens all the time with women.
mhm,
but it happens with everyone, is that
Mhm.
we have a deep relationship to the social, and the social does sort of intertwine with how we see ourselves, how we regard our bodies, and how we actually even account for and even include or even know about an experience that might be happening.
Mhm.
Um, so that's where I think culture and society becomes so important, is how we interpret, even if we're having it, interpret an experience, but even know that we have one.
Mhm.
So this idea of talking about the exceptional on this one side, and then the ordinary, but really weird things happening in the ordinary. What I'm feeling is that you're pushing back and saying, I don't want this to interpret what I think experience is because it's not mine, right? That's kind of what I'm hearing on this other side. And then on this other side, there is this communal stuff, but you're also paying attention on a different level. You don't need the aliens narratives to tell you that you're important, right? Uh,
I mean,
but you
well,
hear what I'm saying, right? There is
I
this
do, I
communal.
do. And I don't want to dismiss the aliens, right?
No, don't, we don't want them to shut us down. Okay, okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, again, for me, it is part of like kind of draw like, I mean, yeah, making sense of the sort of more anomalous stuff, right? Because I mean, again, I think if you sort of experience it, right, like that itself becomes a data point for you in the making sense of it, right? And you can sort of weave this narrative. Um, and so I think for me, from the standpoint of somebody whose experience is not sort of like it just doesn't have so many special effects, I guess. Uh,
Mhm.
right? Like what I'm looking for is a way to, yeah, to bring it all into sort of one framework. Um, right? So how is it that I need to frame my view of reality? Such that, right, I can allow for these anomalous experiences, and I can form some kind of meaningful picture of them. But also, right, they become coherent with, sort of just the way that my experience of the world functions. Which again, like I've come to understand is not exactly like normal, whatever that is. Um, but it isn't that, right? It's much more sort of, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, again, like low key or I mean, ordinary, right? Makes it sound sort of like a cop out, but um yeah, like how does all that stuff live in the same framework, I guess, is what I'm trying to sort of figure out.
And but also, how does all that stuff live in terms of what you feel you're giving as an educator, what you're
Hmm.
giving out as someone that is, I'll say paving the way for the future in terms of your students? What are you trying to give them in terms of what we're discussing right now?
Oh
So
God, I hope I'm trying to give them something.
no, you are. I'm sure you are, but I don't know if there's hope that's needed. But I do think that you are, and so I'm just wondering what you would like them to be tooled with, so to speak, as they go forth.
Yeah. I mean, I think I say this to my students in every single class that I teach. Um, if you feel like by the end of this academic term, right, by the end of this class, you have more questions than answers, and you are in fact more confused about whatever the topic of this class is, like we've probably done a good job, right? So and it's because I teach mostly general education classes. So like a lot of it is this sort of like big picture general stuff. It's mostly the only time that these students are ever going to encounter this particular material. And I teach at Cal Poly in California, and so it's a polytechnic university, right? Most of my students they're engineers, they're computer science majors, they're in agriculture, they're in architecture, right? It's these very sort of like technical disciplines. Um, and so I think like sort of what I see myself doing is sort of bridging that gap to some extent, right? Like, yeah, like go do your engineering, right? Like definitely think about the world in these very systematic ways, right? I mean, not an engineer, right? But my understanding is that like you gotta do the thing a particular way if you want the bridge to stand up straight, right? It's not as though you can kind of like leave the class and be like, what the answer is, right? Like maybe there are more questions than answers. That's not a very useful approach when you're functioning in that arena. Um, but on the other hand, right, like we can be both, and I think we should be both as human beings. Um, and so I think for my students, what I try to sort of really convey of all of this is that, yeah, uh, like stop maybe every once in a while, right? And look at your experience and look at what you're doing and look at why you're doing it in particular. And maybe question that a little bit. Um, and as you question it, maybe take into consideration the fact that your experience may not be this other person's experience. And I do teach a lot of classes that deal with sort of identity, right, and stuff like that. So that's sort of built into the material. Um, that we don't all experience the world in the same way. And that's why, right? I mean, among other reasons, there aren't necessarily kind of hard and fast answers when it comes to this stuff. Because it is that sort of multifacetedness of human experience that's ultimately sort of making this up. But at the same time, like we all sort of have to come together and agree on something as a society, right? And we have to do our calculations and we have to build our bridges and all that kind of stuff. So I think it, yeah, very much sort of still fits into that whole, like, how do we get to a functional full picture, maybe?
The one word that's popping up in my mind is ambiguity. Is that it's very hard in an engineering culture to live with ambiguity,
Mm.
and ambiguity is really what's helped to create the greatest art pieces of the world. And so, to live, whether it's through literature or through arts, through visual arts, through, film, it's really important to be able to learn through discovery and ambiguity. Now, of course, sciences do have a discovery component too. Um, but it doesn't mean that you can't be that and that, you have the ambiguity and, you know, the precision of,
Mhm.
and I don't think that's often taught that way. They're seen as either or trying to fit ambiguity into an engineering framework and just getting rid of it because it doesn't really serve you, right? The bridge
Mhm.
does fall. Um, and I think one of the values that I'm hearing from you is that now that I really understand more that you're kind of in the belly of engineering, Cal Poly, even have even more of an important role because, for people to really be able to know that they don't need to jettison the ambiguous or that piece of discovery where there's so much uncertainty,
Mm.
that they actually can live with that. In fact, they should embrace that. Um, that's where you get really people that I'll say creative engineers that come up with really great solutions. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, and I think it's great. My daughter is super fascinated with the Da Vinci exhibition. And
Mm.
so, it's like, oh, he's an inventor, he's an engineer, but he's an artist too. And he's like, and like, I almost wanted to say, of course, but she's living in a world where there's all the specialization that's very much in place, right?
Mhm.
Those are very separate disciplines. But I think it's a great lesson that that people like you can actually teach and thrive in this kind of nexus, that you're in. And yeah, I know there's not really a question there. I'm just adding. You're saying,
No, that's really helpful. Like, I love that. And I think to some extent, right, like, we all do. I mean, even though I think that like it behooves all of us to have, sort of a more holistic understanding of how all this stuff fits together. On the other hand, we don't all play the same role. I mean, that's true in the humanities as well, right? Like in my discipline, I'm a comparativist. I like to sort of put things, like side by side with one another and try to figure out like, okay, how is one like and unlike the other? And so that means that, often I work on like a sort of more shallow level, to some extent, right? I don't mind using that term, because once you get so deep into the details of something and you get into all those like intricacies and technicalities, it becomes much more difficult to compare. Maybe until you get back down to the base of it all, right? And then you can sort of start finding commonalities again. Um, And so I think that, just in our daily lived experience, it might very well make sense that we sort of specialize, right? That we land, maybe more on one side of the things than the other. Um, but like even so, right? I think it's still helpful to maybe keep the big picture in mind. Just to know that like there is something else out there, right? Like sure, right now I'm designing my bridge, and so like I better get the math right. Um, but on the other hand, sometimes, as you said, even in the sciences, right? Like the math maybe doesn't make sense.
And it's also how we're built. We're built with different levels of reasoning, and also different levels of cognition and emotion. So there are the big picture thinkers already inside of us. There
Mm.
already is the detailist, so to speak, inside of us. It's really how we're wired. How we access and how much we focus on those areas is a whole nother topic. So it is really very deeply human biologically driven that we do reach for the big picture and that we do reach for specificity. Um, I want to ask you kind of what your future research looks like,
Yeah.
and also if you could just it'd be nice to for the audience to get a sense of the books that you've written, or certainly the last one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, as I said, I definitely have sort of uh, slid through most of my career as a yoga historian. Actually, my first book, which is called Biography of a Yogi, which is a play on autobiography of a yogi, the Paramahansa Yogananda book, was very much, I think, inspired by Jeff Kripal's scholarship. I like to say it's about yogis and superpowers. And so even though it's me trying to figure out, just because of where I sort of come from in terms of my yoga teacher training and stuff like that, it's connected to Paramahansa Yogananda's lineage. It is me trying to figure out what that is and kind of, like my first foray into how did modern yoga even happen. But on the other hand, it is also very much sort of asking these questions about like how have we come to sort of imagine the superhuman, right? And like how do we make sense of the weird stuff that like yogis have historically claimed to be able to do, for example. Um, and so in a weird way, I've sort of found myself like coming back to that book over and over and over again, even though it was, it was like my dissertation and I had to like figure out like, okay, like how do I do this? What do I do? And landed on that for a bunch of really random reasons. Yeah, and then I've done a lot more on this kind of historical transmission of yoga effectively, and so kind of talking about how does South Asian and North American European culture sort of blend to produce this stuff? How do particular aspects of yoga culture and South Asian sort of religion more broadly, how do they sort of get translated and how do they migrate? So the most recent manuscript that I just finished is co-authored with a friend of mine, Dr. Shravana Barkataki Varma. And it's looking at Kundalini in particular and how Kundalini, especially as an experience, gets kind of translated from these South Asian sources into everything that it is today. Like I had to sign up for TikTok and figure out what Kundalini looks like on TikTok for this book. So it's been sort of a journey, but I think the next project is really going to double down on that experience portion of the narrative. I think to some extent, as much as I think it's super important for us to know the culture, right, and know the history and know all that social stuff. Again, just from a personal perspective, not that I like know all of it, but I've answered the questions that I've wanted to answer for myself, which do ultimately come back to, kind of how did this even happen? Why are we practicing yoga the way that we're practicing today? How do we get from, this 2,000-year-old philosophical text that's all about this sort of like dualistic meditative sort of framework to just doing lunges in a hot room? Um, and I think having sort of answered those questions, now I'm really curious about like, well, what is it that happens when you do the lunges in the hot room, right? And also maybe how is that not so different from sitting down and trying to sort of separate your consciousness from the material coil or something like that. Um, So yeah, the thing that I think I'm sort of angling towards at this point is talking about what my colleague and I are calling altered states, and talking about experience and talking about how there are in fact sort of multiple modes that we as human beings, both in anomalous circumstances and also very ordinary ones, are able to kind of relate to reality in this way that certainly shouldn't be considered, sort of normal. Um, because it does sort of, I think, cause us to pay attention to our minds, to our bodies, how they're connected to the world in these sort of anomalous ways, even if they don't always look anomalous from the outside.
Anya, I just want to thank you. This is such a great conversation, and I wish I could just put it on pause and then just keep going for the next like 3 hours. Um, but I just do want to thank you from personally, but also from really, I think my audience who are going to really enjoy this. And let's continue the conversation.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. This has been really awesome.
Take good care. We'll see
Alrighty, you too.
you. Bye bye.